You don't need a perfect idea to start a novel. You need a premise strong enough to survive 80,000 words, and most writers never actually test theirs before they start writing. They fall in love with a cool scene or a striking image, assume the rest will sort itself out, and get stuck around chapter 4 wondering why the story stopped moving. In this episode, what a premise actually is, as opposed to just an idea, the one-sentence test that tells you whether yours will hold, and where genuinely strong premises tend to come from in the first place. This is episode 1 of How to Write a Novel, Start to Finish. Let's begin. A vampire detective in Victorian London is an idea. It's a cool image, and it's enough to get you excited about a project, but on its own, it doesn't tell you what the story is actually about. A premise adds the missing piece, a character who wants something specific, and an obstacle that makes getting it genuinely hard. A vampire detective who must solve a murder before his own bloodlust exposes him and ends his career. That's a premise. Notice the difference. The idea gives you a world and a character type. The premise gives you a story with forward motion, because it implies conflict from the very first sentence. Here's a fast way to check your premise. Try to state it in one sentence with 3 parts, a character, a want, and an obstacle standing in the way. If you can't fit those 3 things into one sentence, your premise isn't finished yet, even if your world and characters feel fully formed in your head. This single sentence will become your compass for almost every plotting decision that follows, from which scenes belong in the book to which ones are actually just interesting detours you can cut later. Let's test a real one. A grieving widow must expose her late husband's business partner as a fraud, before the partner frames her for his death. Characters: the widow. Want: to clear her name and expose the fraud. Obstacle: a powerful, well-connected partner, actively working against her. All 3 parts are there in one sentence, which means there's already a built-in source of conflict on every page. She's not just investigating, she's being actively opposed. Compare that to a story about grief and betrayal in a small town. True, possibly, but there's no obstacle, no want, nothing yet to structure a plot around. Most premises come from one of 2 places: a what-if question that collides 2 ideas that don't normally belong together, or a personal obsession, a question about people or the world you genuinely can't stop turning over. Both work equally well. What matters isn't the source, it's whether the premise creates tension on its own, before you've added a single subplot, a single secondary character, or a single twist. If the core sentence has no built-in friction, no amount of subplot can rescue it later. Once you have a premise, ask "and then what happens" 5 times in a row. If each answer opens up new complications rather than closing the story down, you likely have enough material for a novel. If you run out of answers after 2 or 3 questions, the premise is probably too thin for a full-length book. You're looking at a strong short story idea, not a 200-page one, and that's useful to know now, rather than 60,000 words in. Let's recap. A premise needs a character, a want, and an obstacle, and it should hold up in one sentence, not a paragraph. It should come from either a what-if collision or a genuine personal obsession. And it should survive being asked "then what happens" 5 times in a row without running dry. Get this right before you write a single scene, and everything downstream, your outline, your characters, even your ending, gets noticeably easier, because you're building on solid ground instead of guessing. Once your premise passes that test, you're ready for the next step, turning it into a structure loose enough to leave room for discovery, but solid enough that you never sit down not knowing what happens next. That's episode 2, Outlining Your Novel. If you're following this series to actually finish a manuscript, rather than just watch about one, subscribe so the next episode doesn't get lost in your feed. I'll see you there.